I fell on the jetway, and that's when I had the aneurysm, was on the jetway. Um, so the fact that it happened out in public in the morning at an airport, first responders could get to me, which is what basically saved my life.
Welcome back to Mama Mabel's Caregivers podcast, where we shine a light on the unseen strength, heartbreak, and hope in the caregiving journey. Today's story is one of resilience that will stop you in your tracks. Imagine surviving a ruptured brain aneurysm and a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and just as you begin to rebuild your life, you become the full-time caregiver for your mother as she battles ALS. That's the journey of our guest today, Andrew Davie, and it's one you won't forget. Andrew's story is layered. He's worn many hats, working in theater, finance, and education, teaching English and creative writing across the U.S. and internationally on a Fulbright grant. He's written fiction, co-hosted a music review show, and most recently earned his degree in clinical mental health counseling. Now, he serves as an LGPC and consults for James Madison University on brain injury assessments. But behind the accomplishments is a deeply human experience, one of trauma, healing, sacrifice, and unconditional love. In this episode, Andrew opens up about what it meant to go from being a survivor to becoming a caregiver. We talk about identity, mental health, grief, and the emotional complexity of caring for someone who once cared for you. If you've ever wondered how someone survives the unimaginable and still shows up to care for someone else, this episode is for you. Let's get into it. Hello, Andrew Davie. Welcome to Mama Mabel's Caregivers podcast. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me on as a guest.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on and to be a guest. We had a conversation and it really resonated with me, and I felt that it would be great to share with the podcast family. Podcast family, today's episode is entitled, He Survived a Brain Aneurysm, then Became His Mother's Caregiver. This will be a dynamic conversation. I ask that you please listen to this episode and that you share it. With that said, let's jump right into it. Andrew, tell me about yourself.
Well, I'm originally from New York City, and I had wanted to be a writer, an author for a very long time. So most of the jobs that I'd had in my 20s were not really career path jobs, but just sort of to pay the bills while I could write. Eventually, I went to graduate school for writing, and while I was there, I discovered teaching, and then that became something that I was more passionate about, so I became a teacher and would write on the side. I had the opportunity to teach in Asia for 2 years. So I was in Macau and Hong Kong, and then I moved back to the United States, and I've been in Virginia for about the last decade. Well, so this is all sort of leading towards, in the beginning of 2018, I was going to publish my first crime fiction book with a small press that would come out in 2019, but it was accepted in January, I think, of 2018. So that year, I decided at the end of the year that I wasn't going to renew my teaching contract, but that I would look into PhD programs for writing. So in June of 2018, I turned 40. And on June 29th, I was going to fly to go visit my parents and my brother and his family who were visiting them in South Carolina. And when I got to the airport, everything was fine, except when I got to my gate, I started to sweat uncontrollably, which at the time probably was a red flag, but I assumed I'm maybe getting the flu or a cold or something like that. This is also before COVID. So they called my group to board, and I tried to lift my backpack, and it felt like I had bricks in the backpack, which again, coupled with the sweating, was probably a major red flag. Um, so I scanned my ticket, and the floor started to shift, like I was at a fun house at a carnival. Um, but at the time, I wasn't really thinking clearly. I just remember thinking this is going to make it more complicated to get on the plane. Um, so I fortunately tried to walk forward, and I fell on the jetway. Um, and that's when I had the aneurysm, was on the jetway. Um, so the fact that it happened out in public in the morning at an airport, first responders could get to me, which is what basically saved my life. Um, so they uh, took me right to a hospital. Um, the last thing I remember saying before I lost consciousness was, "I can't miss my flight," because all I could think about was how upset my mother was going to be that I missed the flight. Um, but I remember hearing someone say, "Don't worry, you'll catch another flight," and I said, "Okay." And then um, the airline I was on was JetBlue, and I had filled out the emergency contact information. So they called my mother to let her know that I'd missed my flight, but no one really knew any information. So I think for the first few hours, my family assumed that I had just tripped, or I was clumsy, that I fell, but that I was okay. And then when I was in the hospital, one of the neurosurgeon's physician's assistants found my cell phone and saw a bunch of missed calls, and recognized the same last name. So he called my brother, told them what had happened, and everyone cut the vacation short to come up to the hospital in Washington, D.C. So I was in intensive care for about 3 weeks, I think. I don't have any memory of it, but I've seen cell phone videos of me having conversations with people. Um, so I think I was under so many sedatives, and it was such a traumatic experience that I've just sort of blocked it from my mind. Um, but I regained cognizance, was moved to rehab after I sort of made it through a series of setbacks. I think I had a second bleed, which could have been fatal. Um, they had to monitor me for something called vasospasms, which I think can also be fatal. Unfortunately, I didn't have them. I did, however, keep trying to go to the bathroom, even though I had a catheter. So I was able to crawl out of bed, and I fell and broke my nose. So they needed to have a sitter with me. Um, but fortunately, I managed to make it through everything. And then I regained my faculties. I was in the hospital for about a week and a half in rehab. And then I moved out of the hospital and back into my apartment. And my mother stayed with me for about 2 weeks. And she basically became my caregiver during that time. She would make sure that I did my exercises. We would both walk the halls of my apartment building together. I had a cane at the time, and I wore an eye patch because I had double vision. And I would really only be able to walk for about 30 seconds before I would need to take a break. Um, but she was great about. We would be watching TV, and she would turn off the TV and say, "Okay, let's go for a walk." Um, she would drive me to my various outpatient therapies. Um, the only unpleasant thing was that I would vomit every morning when I woke up, which we were both a little concerned about. But um, when I went to see a GI doctor, he said that that was a side effect of the procedure, so that would go away. Um, and then we moved back into my parents' house because that would be a little bit easier for everyone. Um, and I think I was there till the end of the year, the end of 2018. Um, and that's sort of when the physical recovery began to taper off. I didn't need to walk with a cane anymore. My endurance came back. My double vision cleared. Um, and I moved back to my apartment again at the beginning of the year by myself. So that's when the emotional recovery started.
Okay.
I think I was under the impression that um, when I returned home to my apartment, it would be like putting on an old jacket that still fit. Like I would just return back to my life and everything would be the same as it was before. But I would learn that the next 2 years, roughly, would be a very difficult emotional recovery, um, just due to the changes that I'd experienced. My ability to process things emotionally had changed. There was some emotional blunting, so that made it a little bit difficult. I had always assumed that I would either get married or be in a romantic relationship with someone, um, possibly start a family. But the fact that it became difficult to make emotional connections with someone sort of hindered that. Um, my book came out and nothing really changed. So I also had to kind of reconcile the fact that being a published author wasn't going to get me onto, a late night talk show or suddenly open doors. Um, I went back to teaching as a substitute teacher at my old school, but it was a little too overwhelming to be in the classroom. So even though I went back for about 6 months, um, it was probably a mistake. Uh, and then I got a job as a tutor that was going to start in March of 2020 or April of 2020. Um, but the COVID pandemic happened, so the job got canceled. Um, and I moved back in with my parents, which turned out to be a silver lining because I could just focus on the emotional recovery and healing and not have to worry about any other obligations. So I would say that's really where I began to feel comfortable with the fact that there were going to be changes. And it allowed me to sort of revisit my values and priorities. Um, so that was really helpful at the time. Um, and I made the decision to leave teaching behind and become a mental health counselor so that I could help other people um, recovering from traumatic or acquired brain injuries. So I applied to school, to graduate school, and I in DC, and I went back to the Chicago school where I got my degree. Um, and I also was able to change my view of writing. Now it became something that I would just find joy doing, that I wouldn't focus so much on the results. If I got published again or if people read it, it was more just an opportunity for me to uh, enjoy the process of creation. So I began to feel much more comfortable with the fact that my life was going to look different than I had anticipated, but that was suddenly okay. I started seeing a therapist who practices somatic experience, which is a way to sort of um, revisit and get in touch with your emotional processing. So that was really helpful. Um, I became friendly with somebody who I speak with every day, um, who lives in Illinois and is married to somebody, but she is able to sort of fill that companion role, which is something I wouldn't have expected previously. I would have thought that the type of friendship we have was only reserved for people who are spouses. Um, so there was a lot of conditioning that was undone from the aneurysm. Um, and then in 2022, unfortunately, that's when my mother was officially diagnosed with ALS.
Okay, so
Sure.
let's pause right there because you have just given a wonderful walkthrough of your life story thus far and your experiences from the symptoms of having an aneurysm to going through the process of the healing stage, being in a hospital, coming out and having to relearn, and then having your mother by your side as your caregiver. I have so many questions. So
Ask away.
awesome. So going back to the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've heard people say that who have had an aneurysm and have survived it because usually, I mean, many people don't survive a brain aneurysm. But for some that do, they always state that they had like a really bad headache.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have that?
I didn't. So typically, um, I think, and this isn't to scare anyone. What I always suggest is to people that if they have a history of aneurysms in their family, that they should get checked for it. Um, because a lot of people will develop an aneurysm in their lifetime that won't rupture. It will just be there. Um, so what's problematic is that the fact that it can rupture. Um, Mine did. I didn't have any other symptom. There was no. What you're talking about is called typically a thunderclap headache. Um, I didn't have any thunderclap headache. There was nothing painful. I was really fortunate that the only symptoms I had were that I started to sweat and then eventually the floor began to move. Um, those were the only two symptoms. Um, what's interesting is now, or in the, so it's been about 7 years since the aneurysm. Um, the only physical limitations I still have are that my balance isn't 100%. It's really difficult to articulate what it's like because every time I feel like I'm close to describing it accurately, it's not really the best description. I can only suggest that it feels like something is a little bit off. Um, the other thing that happens is if I move my head side to side, like if I turn around 180 degrees, um, I have to wait for my vision to settle. Um, I'm sort of like a human bobblehead, um, but I don't get nauseated. So that's just something that I've gotten used to now in 7 years. That if I turn my head, I have to wait. Like for example, if I'm going to turn to go down some stairs, I should wait a second before I take a step because I don't want to misjudge the distance. Um, so yeah, to answer your question, I was really lucky. I didn't have any. Nothing was painful. No headaches. No nothing. Um, and they're not sure why it happened. I don't have a family history. Um, I think sometimes if you have like a severe cocaine addiction, that may bring along something like this, but I didn't have that. So I think I was just one of the unfortunate few people who experienced something like this.
Okay. Okay, thank you for sharing that. So going back to when you were in the hospital, you said you don't remember a lot from that, the 3 weeks that you were there. So now you're out. How were you feeling about that? Where were you emotionally?
Well, it took about 3 years before I felt comfortable. Um, there was a lot of not depression, but I think I had been so fixated on imagining that life would have value if you achieved the following goals. Um, for me, it was to be a recognized published author, to be in a romantic relationship or get married or have kids. And one of those things happened, but it didn't bring the results I had hoped for. And the other one seemed like it was not as important anymore. So that was the biggest hurdle, was to then imagine, well, what is the point now moving forward? Um, and that took a long time to feel comfortable that I might not know yet what what would have the equivalent value, but that it existed. Um, that the opportunity for me to do something worthwhile was there, and I would just need to leave room for it. My therapist, who does the somatic experience, the buzzwords she usually uses are just be curious and be aware. So once I felt confident enough to just accept that, be aware and be curious, and but yeah, that took about 3 years. The physical recovery tapered off after about a year, so I had assumed that the emotional recovery was happening at the same time. That was the biggest surprise to me, was that they would happen separately. I think I was so focused on physically recovering that once that kind of ended, then all of a sudden the emotional stuff came in. Um, Plus, I when I was in the hospital and I was doing speech language therapy, I would fill out abstract thinking worksheets because I my ability to think abstractly was gone. Um, and then when I was at my parents' house one night, all of a sudden it came back. And I remember thinking, okay, this is how the recovery is going to be. Some of these things that are missing will just suddenly come back, like somebody's cast a spell on me. So, because the physical recovery happened very quickly, and because my ability to think abstractly happened quickly, I assumed that everything else would sort of happen on my timetable and in the manner that I thought it would happen. The way that the other recovery elements have happened. So it took a while for me to realize that um, the recovery was going to happen in a spiral, and that I would just need to be patient. And it took a little bit of time to get to that point.
I appreciate the level of honesty, transparency, and vulnerability that you're opening up and that you're sharing with the podcast family. You said something that really resonated with me, and it's talking about how we can have in our mind a certain way that we think life is going to be, and what we consider to be success. And then, we're out here, we're living life, we have these dreams, we're working towards some, for the people who decide to pursue it, to work towards it. And then something happens that's completely out of our control. And now we're in a place where life changes, and then you have to redefine what all of these things mean again, what success looks like and what that means, what a relationship looks like, what that means. Are you going to have children? Will you not have children? Like, all of these things can change. And I believe that's something that a lot of people have experienced. I know that I have experienced that as well, in like many areas of my life. And to your point, what I think was great is that you stated that you went to therapy and you had a great therapist to help walk you through that. They have something that's called, and I'm sure everyone has heard of this, like midlife crisis. Like, you hit your 40s and then you're just like, oh my God, what's going on? Where am I at? Do I have this or that? That's actually real. And again, that coincides in part with what you just brought up, because you have to redefine. We all have a certain way of what we think everything's going to look like and what's going to happen to us once we even achieve certain goals. But then life has a way of, as I call it, lifing. And
Sure.
at the same time, if you're open to it, like your therapist said, she said, be curious. And it was curious, and what else?
Aware.
Aware. Yes. And I took that to mean, for me, present.
Yeah, yeah.
Curious and aware slash present. Life will open up a lot more to you, and you'll have other things and options that you can really experience to continue to create a very full life. So thank you for sharing that. As it pertains to the caregiving that your mother provided, how did it make you feel to know that your mom was still there and that she was still focused on her baby?
It was wonderful. I mean, she and I have always had a very close relationship, um, but she's always been very supportive and very nurturing. Uh, so it wasn't strange that she would choose to move back in and assume that role. Um, it was great because I think as much as I felt like I was uh, in control of everything, looking back on it now, I probably needed a lot of support and help. So I was grateful that she was able to do that. Um, and we as tragic as it was, we had a really wonderful time spending time together. I think that's most 40-year-olds don't really have the. Now, obviously, I would have preferred the context to be a little different, but um, most people my age don't really have the time to spend that much time with either of their parents. So this was an opportunity for us to just be close, which was nice.
That's very beautiful. To just piggyback upon what you just stated, I remember at one time I had a friend of mine who was in between jobs, and this was during a certain time period of their life. They were in between jobs and they had to move back home with their parents. And this friend of mine was a city person, but their parents lived in the country south somewhere where my friend didn't even have good cell phone service. So, of course, they were not happy. And at the time, their father was ill. I remember having a conversation with that friend and saying, hey, enjoy this time in your life because it won't come back. Like, how many children, like grown children, can actually say that they had that amount of time with their parent, that intimate time with their parent, you know? So it was a beautiful thing. And what ended up happening was after some time, my friend's parent ended up passing away. And as we talked about it later in life, the friend shared with me how grateful that they were that they actually kind of just changed their mindset because they were in between jobs, they had to go home. It really provided that person with an opportunity to spend quality time with their father, which is something that can never be replaced, you know?
Sure.
So that's beautiful that you were able to have that type of relationship and the type of QT with your mom. Were there any fun things that she would do or anything to help lift your spirits during that time?
Yeah. Well, one of the things. So she brought her iPad with her from South Carolina, and it was still, um, I guess, on the network TV from down there. So we would get local South Carolina commercials every night. We would watch Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, and there would be a commercial from the local Geico representative, Tony Kalgakoulis. Um, so he became kind of like a symbol of the recovery, where we would both look forward to seeing Tony every night, and we would laugh at because after a while I would memorize what he was saying and I would say it along with him. So that was something that we sort of had together, where we would watch Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy every night, and then sing Tony's praises.
That's just beautiful. It's really interesting how the simplest memories are the ones that have the strongest impact. All right, so now you're back home.
Mm-hmm.
You were able to physically recover enough to go back home, and you said, and that's when the emotions hit you. Your emotional
Yes,
recovery started.
I think it was. I mean, it's been um, about 5 or 6 years. Um, But yeah, I think it was sort of a kind of slow burn type thing where um, suddenly I began thinking about these things. Previously, it was just physical things like walking and building up endurance and my double vision going away. But now it sort of became like, okay, that's done. Now, how am I going to live my life? Um, what are the things that are going to be valuable to me that mean anything? Um, so my first instinct was to try and do the things that were valuable previously, but for whatever reason they didn't have the same gravity that they had had before. So I think in the beginning it was probably just overwhelming, um, but it was like an overwhelming, lingering thing, um, to the point where I had been taking Prozac to help with OCD previously, um, which I had stopped. So I went back on Prozac to help kind of manage some of the emotional turmoil.
Now, when you were back in your medication, well, when did you decide, well, hey, let me go and talk to a therapist?
Well, I went to go visit my brother, who's a doctor, and I, in the morning, was crying, just without really any provocation. And I remember telling him that this happened most mornings now, and that I'd be okay in about an hour. And he said, "Well, that might be something you want to see somebody about, because typically starting your morning crying for no reason is not the healthiest way to go about doing it." So that was the indication that I should go see someone.
I advocate for therapy, 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 because podcast family, we're human, right? And so there comes a point in time within everyone's lives that at some point you may need to talk to a therapist, and to know that it's okay, because there's still some cultures that and still some taboos out there, that frown against it or say you should be strong enough or you're strong or let's just have some prayer or go through the prayer line. Like there's so many things that are out there, and there's nothing wrong with prayer. For those who believe in that, there's nothing wrong with considering yourself to be strong, but at the same time you are human. So it's important to, while we're all having this human experience, it's very important for us to utilize all of the tools that are here that can help us along our journey. And therapy is one. I don't care if you're stressed out on the job, you need someone to talk to. You could talk to a therapist about that. If you're going through anything emotional, you could talk to a therapist about that. Because to your point, Andrew, your brother was able to recognize it, to say, like, yeah, no, you're not supposed to be crying like that every day. But podcast family, we can get into such a place where something like that can become very normal to us, you know? So that's why it's important to involve your loved ones like you did, because it sounds like you're very close to your brother.
Mm-hmm.
And let the ones that you truly care about in, because they may be able to see something that you might not be able to see or recognize at the time. And they may also be able to recommend some services for you. And in this case, your brother's like, yeah, no, no, brother, go, you should, check that out. And you did, and it helped you along your journey.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's about. All right. So now we're at the place where your mom was diagnosed with ALS.
Yeah, so I had been um, taking classes and going to school. I had just started my internship, which was virtual, which was great. Um, and so originally my mother had an aide that would come in during the day to help out. She could still walk. Um, she would use a walker, um, and she could talk and eat and do everything. She just needed some help. So the aide would be there for the morning, and then my father would take over in the evening. Um, and then I went to visit them in for July 4th of 2023. And my father told me that he was really struggling being able to take care of my mother by himself in the evenings. So we made the decision collectively that I would move back in. Um, I think I only had 2 classes left to take, maybe. Um, and then my internship, which was virtual anyway. So I was able to move back in with them and basically become one of her primary caregivers. Uh, so it was really interesting because she continued to kind of regress pretty quickly, and then she would plateau. So, but I was able to provide a quality of life for her, where I could organize. I sort of took over emailing her friends. I created a Caring Bridge page so that everyone would have information. Um, I worked in tandem with the aide to kind of give her medications and make sure she was fed. We would take her to visit people. Um, so me being there really kind of opened a lot of doors so that she wouldn't be isolated. Plus, it also took a lot of pressure off my father, so he didn't have to um, help out as often. He was still great; he would help out, but he really needed time to kind of decompress and process everything that was happening. So um, so I was there in total probably about a year and a half. She passed in September of 2024. So from the end of end of June of 2023 until September of 2024, um, I basically would. And um, it's interesting because you'd asked me about when we talked about Tony Kalgakoulis, I printed out a photo of him. One of the things that I did was I created a shrine. So my mother couldn't sleep in her bed anymore. She would sleep in an easy chair, and the easy chair was in the living room that would face a coffee table. So I made a shrine on the coffee table of all these photographs of family and things that would cheer her up. And one of them was a photo of Tony Kalgakoulis from when she and I would. Um, so that continued to be a symbol of hope and recovery. Although in my mother's case, we all sort of knew there is no recovery from ALS, um, but she really dealt with it in an admirable way. She never complained. Um, my brother and his family came to visit as often as possible, and my mother had 2 brothers who would come to visit uh, every month, I would say. Um, and she had a really wonderful network of friends who would come by. I mean, one of the things that I recall is that she had something to do every day. Um, we also had a lot of really great technology that was lent to us. There's a wonderful organization called Compassionate Care ALS that will loan you devices. So we had a motorized wheelchair for her. We had an eye gaze machine so she could communicate with her eyes. Um, and there were some support groups. So I would usually wake up in the morning and begin helping out, either feeding her or going with her to an appointment or organizing some sort of rendezvous with friends. And then I was able to take classes asynchronously, so I didn't have to attend them at any. I basically just had to do the homework, and then I would counsel clients in my internship in the evenings. And what was interesting is I was basically, my whole day was dictated to me. So I didn't have to worry about making any decisions on my own. It was basically like this is what we need to do today. This is what we need to do tomorrow. I would usually get about an hour to myself. I would take a nap usually because I was pretty drained. But what was interesting is taking care of my mother became the fulfilling thing that I had originally thought getting married and having kids or writing a book would fill. Um, Not to mention the fact that it was difficult to make emotional connections meant that I wouldn't be overwhelmed emotionally when things got really sad. I remember there were a couple of conversations that my brother and sister-in-law and my father would have with my mother where people would be crying about the future, but it sort of just washed over me. So I was really able to kind of take an objective point of view, um, which was really helpful. Uh, and I think as a result of that, she was able to have a quality of life that I don't think most people in her position have. So she would regularly have support groups that she would meet with virtually on Zoom. Um, and I think she was the oldest. So she was 75 when she was diagnosed, which is on the older end. I think there was some misdiagnosing going on because I think people didn't think that someone that age would have ALS. Um, Most people seem to be in their 50s or 60s. So, but the biggest concern that everyone always had was, I'm not sure how I can physically take care of this person without help. Um, so I was in a unique position to move back in, and I could physically like lift my mother and help transfer her from her couch to her wheelchair. Um, I also looked into some technology. There's something called a pivot disc, where it's like a turntable that you can stand on. Because one thing we had found was very difficult is when we would have to transfer her, we'd have to move her feet. But on the pivot disc, you would just stand her up and you could rotate her without her having to move her feet. So there were things like that were innovative that really helped. But again, you needed to be able to physically lift her out of the chair, which I was able to do. So aside from being able to provide engaging activities for her, I could also physically help her move around, which I think was difficult for a lot of other people. So, but even when that was challenging in terms of balancing everything, I was always really motivated because I'd finally found the thing that would provide the fulfillment I was looking for. Um, so if I was tired or if I was frustrated with something, that would always kind of, I would reflect on the fact that I had the opportunity to move in. Um, certain things like if I'd been married, if I'd had children, it would have probably made it much more difficult to seamlessly transition to being a caregiver. Um, so things that seemed like they were negative suddenly had a silver lining, and and it turned out to be, while it was at times really tragic, and obviously we wished that she wouldn't have been diagnosed with ALS. Um, I also got to spend a year and a half with my parents, and have these memories now that I can think about.
That's very well said. What I'm coming to learn is life happens the way that it needs to. And to your point, because you were available, you were truly able to be there for both your parents in a way that you would not have been able to be there if life had have happened differently for you. And from your experience, what you're able to forever take with you are the beautiful memories. And so, of course, I resonate with that. Podcast family, y'all know me by now, and you know my story. You all know how close I was to my beloved mother, I think about all the memories that I have with her because we were so close and we spent so much time together. And then I had an opportunity to take care of her. That's something that will always be worth more than gold to me. Those memories worth more than gold to me. So that's the beautiful thing. Within what you said, you also touched on various resources that you were able to use. How did you learn about the resources for ALS?
Well, when I got there, my mother had already become involved with some of these nonprofit groups. So I just had the opportunity to continue to research uh, the website. Um, she had she needed to have a feeding tube inserted at one point when it became difficult for her to eat. And when she was at the hospital, I saw that she was on something called a PureWick external catheter, which meant she could just go to the bathroom and she wouldn't need to be moved to a toilet. She could just go. So I spoke to the person who runs Compassionate Care ALS, and I said, I saw this device called the PureWick device, and I wonder if they have them for people at home. And he said, "Oh yeah, we have the PureWick. I'll send you one." So that became a game. There were certain moments where the device that we got changed the game. Like the pivot disc changed the game. The PureWick device changed the game. A Hoyer lift, which is kind of like a crane that we would eventually need to use, that was a game changer. But um, the hospital, I think my mother would go to the Medical University of South Carolina's ALS clinic, and they had some really wonderful people there that would tell us about certain devices. But also, I would look at Compassionate Care ALS's website and just see what they had to offer. So um, it was a little bit of coming into a situation that was already up and running, and a little bit of me just sort of nosing around and seeing what was available.
Very insightful and very interesting as well to know that your mother already had gotten involved with nonprofits, and per what you were sharing with me earlier, she had her iPad. So it sounded like she knew how to use technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think by the time I got involved as a caregiver, the operation was already up and running. So I kind of came into it with some new ideas, but they had already had meetings with people and been given resources. So it was a combination of both.
Okay. From your experience, are there any best practices that you found that really helped you along your way that you would like to share with the podcast family?
One of the things that really helped just in life was, and I'll often mention this to some of my clients when I'm working with them. Uh, it's called the parable of the horse, and it's there's a farmer who has a horse that runs away, and the farmer's neighbor comes over to him the next day and says, "Oh, what awful luck! Your horse ran away." And the farmer said, "Well, let's see." So the horse comes back the next day, and it brings 4 wild horses with it. So the neighbor says to the farmer, "Oh, what great luck! You've got 5 horses now." And the farmer says, "Well, let's see." So the farmer's son tries to train one of the wild horses and gets thrown and breaks his leg. And the neighbor says, "Oh, that's so awful. Your son broke his leg." And the farmer says, "Well, let's see." So the next day, the army comes to the town to take all of the young men to fight on the front lines, but they can't take the son because he has a broken leg. So sometimes we judge things very quickly before they have an opportunity to either pay off or be fully realized. So that was something that I learned in my own recovery, but also taking care of my mother, is just to try and be as objective as possible. Um, with just being aware of how things are, um, and recognizing sometimes there are silver linings in things that may seem unpleasant at first.
I love that analogy that you just gave. I'm actually going to add that to my personal repertoire because I love that analogy you just gave. And what you said, I mean, is dead on. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing your experience with us. Podcast family, in addition to Andrew's experience that he has as being cared for and then also becoming a caregiver, Andrew did mention that he is a published author. And I like to just change gears and talk about his new book that he just came out with. The book is called Ambiguous Win, and it's a fictional book. I'm going to let Andrew tell you more about that.
Sure, thank you. Well, I actually have a copy of it here. So it's called Ambiguous Win. You can get it on Amazon in print, but you can get it through a lot of different e-readers, all Apple Books, Kobo, Kindle. So when I was taking a grief class at school, I learned about a type of grief called ambiguous loss. And that's typically when you're grieving somebody who's missing physically, like if a body gets lost at sea, for example, or if someone goes missing, or if someone has dementia, for example, and they're not there mentally. And it struck me that that would probably be the most difficult type of grief to manage because there's no resolution to it. So I had written a couple of crime fiction books previously, and my thought was I'll write about somebody who decides to find missing people and kind of help families with the resolution. Even if the person is dead, then they still understand that there's finality to it. And then I thought that I would have the lead character also have a brain aneurysm because even though I've written nonfiction about my experience, I had never incorporated that into anything fictional. So I thought that would give it an interesting angle to it. And that would be his motivation to want to help other people. So originally, at the beginning of the book, he's a high-powered lawyer who works at a prestigious firm. And after the aneurysm, he goes out on his own and teams up with his former investigator. And then throughout the book, there are examples of real-life cases of ambiguous loss where I discuss famous people who have gone missing. And then it's I guess it's a crime fiction mystery. So, and it's short. It's only about 100 pages because I tend to write short stories and novellas. So if you're looking for something that you can read very quickly, then this is right up your alley.
Okay, that's great. And for the caregiving family, I've been talking about this within other episodes that will be aired. Really taking time for self-care. That's the theme for caregivers because we don't really do that. It's hard. It can be very challenging for us to do while you're being a caregiver to your loved one. It's important that you make time for yourself. And one way that you can make time for yourself is by reading. Reading, I love reading. Reading gives us a chance to just escape, and it gives you an opportunity to really be there in the story as it's unfolding. Kind of like how people go and watch television. Some people like to watch TV because that's their way of getting away, exercising, journaling. But reading has always been fundamental. You can learn so much, and it can also provide you that opportunity to really focus on self care And you can do that by just incorporating, I would say, about 15 minutes a day. I've shared this before, so I'm sharing this again. I was introduced to taking about 15 minutes a day to read when I was in high school. So back in the day in high school, they had something called SSR, which stood for Sustained Silent Reading. And I'm going to say, I don't know if it was the third hour or the fourth hour, but my whole school for that hour every day would have to take 15 minutes to read. And it would start off by one of the students giving a quote for the day or a definition of a word for the day. When I was in the 12th grade, I became that person that was over the speaker in high school giving the quote of the day. And everybody, if you were in band, if you were in gym, if you were in history class, math class, language, whatever class you were in, once the speaker came on, and it would happen from like 11 to 11:15 a.m. Around that time, everybody would have to read. So that's something that I've always kept with me, because from that experience, I learned at a young age that I don't have to devote a whole hour to reading a book. I could devote 15 minutes to reading a book and still progress. And I could still do that and incorporate that within self-care as well. Podcast family, I ask that you check out Andrew Davie's book. It's called Ambiguous Win. That information will be in the description of this podcast. And I will also ensure to include the link to Amazon. In addition, I'm also going to include Andrew's website. So if you're interested in other books that Andrew has written, that will be available for them there. All right. So, Andrew, thank you again for agreeing to come and be a guest on Mama Mabel's Caregivers podcast. It has been a pleasure having you on. I sincerely appreciate you sharing your experiences, your stories, being open, honest, transparent. I truly believe that this will help people and also resonate with them as well.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Well, until next time, podcast family, we'll see you.